Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Just as a friendly reminder, if you are interested in taking a look at the show notes and the relevant resources and links that are found in them, you can find all of that at jaredoleary.com, where there are no ads, there are no affiliate links, nothing like that. Everything on my website is free for you to use. In today's discussion, I'm going to speak with Sandra Ahlstrom from Wyoming. We're going to talk about transfer of understanding across programming languages. We're going to talk about collaboration, the kind of impact we want to have in the classroom, facilitation, and differences in engagement among gender types. Now, a quick note about that discussion. In my response, I only mentioned male and female, and the reason why is because the question was asked about the K-8 coding classes that I facilitated. And in those classes, I did not have kids who openly identified to me as outside of male or female binary. Now, I say this as somebody who actually does identify as non-binary or gender nonconformist. So even though it was left out of that discussion, I just want to say to everybody else who identifies this way, don't worry, I got your back. And if you are very confused about what I'm talking about between gender and non-binary, it's basically saying that gender is a spectrum and that there is not just male or female. If you want to actually learn more about this, there's some resources in the show notes that will link to NCWIT, which is the National Center for Women in Information Technology, and it can provide a lot of helpful resources to help you support marginalized gender identities. And with that being said, I'm now going to start the podcast with an introduction by Sandy.
My name is Sandra Ahlstrom, and I am currently the elementary technology teacher for my district. And I work at 5 different elementary schools, and I teach 1st through 5th grade. And my class is an enrichment class. So not all the students come to me, but I get quite a few. And I teach not only computer science, but I'm also mandated to teach creative pieces where the students are learning to be producers on technology and not just consumers. My biggest piece, though, is definitely coding in my curriculum.
And what state are you in?
I'm in Wyoming.
So if you were to kind of write a book about your CS education journey, what would the titles of the chapters be?
You know, I've taken kind of a very winding road to where I am now. So probably my first chapter would be English teacher. No. And then Air Force career. No. And then computer science professional, and finally a yes. And a teacher, a very, very strong yes.
So what led you out of the classroom into CS as a professional and then going back into the classroom working with CS education?
When I first went to school, I came out with a computer science degree, and I worked in that industry for several years. We decided to move to a small town in Wyoming, and so I thought I was leaving technology behind and ended up becoming a teacher, and the position of elementary technology teacher opened up just as I was ready to start teaching. And so that's how I ended up back in technology, but also in teaching. So it was a perfect blend of what I really wanted to do.
So what's something that you believed when you first started teaching that you no longer believe?
I definitely thought that I had to be the giver of knowledge, you know, that I had to know it all before my students, and that I needed to impart my knowledge onto them. I definitely had that feeling going into teaching. I definitely don't feel that way anymore, especially with computer science. It's such a broad subject, and there are so many languages, and, you know, nobody can be the expert in everything. And really, to be a good computer science professional of whatever, you need to have the skills of learning yourself, you know, not learning specifics, but being able to teach yourself, learn to do things on your own that aren't cut and dry.
Yeah, so I have a lot of questions about that. So what do you think led to your initial belief that you needed to have all the knowledge? Because like I had that as well, and I have my own thoughts on that, but I'm curious what yours are.
I don't know if it's just from, you know, old school. When I was going to school, I just felt that the teachers knew and I didn't. Maybe it was a little bit insecurity just going in thinking that I needed to have the answers right then for the students whenever they had a question.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know where else I got that attitude. It was just something that I was ingrained in me, I guess.
I know for me, part of my transition was that when I was in school and I was observing teachers, I didn't observe their thought processes. So I didn't know what they were thinking, why they were doing things. I didn't know when they may or may not have had an answer. So I always assumed that they did. But then when I actually started teaching, I was just like, oh, wait, I actually don't know everything that I need to know to be able to do this. I'm constantly learning new things, whether it was when I was teaching music or teaching coding or whatever. That for me was kind of like a catalyst that helped shift my mindset away from that. I'm wondering, was there anything in particular that like led you to where you are now and why you no longer believe that?
I think it was when I first started this job, coding was not a part of my curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
It was just long ago when I started that there weren't all these websites, that you could teach coding. It wasn't something that people were thinking about, and there weren't the resources to do that. I know I remember looking into it and I couldn't find any way to really teach coding. So my job at the time was to teach basic computer skills. And that, I mean, I had done so much teaching, Microsoft and everything that I did know pretty much all the answers.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started going into coding, realizing that, even if I do know really the answers, that's not the way to teach it, because seeing them discover things on their own was so much more powerful. And so I think that's probably more where I kind of made that transition.
What languages have you taught over the years?
Block-based, a few different block-based venues, and then I do some with Python and some with JavaScript.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm starting a few kids on, I know it's not technically coding, but HTML, just touching a little bit on that.
Yeah, one of the things that I really like about coding is that the concepts transfer over across languages and the practices, but you need to learn the specific syntax of it. So when I was learning Java to propose to my wife through a mod that I was working on, like I knew how to do stuff in other languages. I was like, oh, I need to figure out how to transfer this over. And so that also kind of carried over into the classroom, because in my class, there were several different languages that kids could work on. And they might ask me a question where I'd be like, oh, well, I know how to do that in Scratch, or I know how to do that in Swift, but I haven't thought about it in JavaScript. Give me some time to like work through it on my own. So I don't know if that is kind of similar for you, since you've been working with multiple languages.
Yeah, and actually, I've thought about that. In fact, I rethink what I'm doing every year.
Mm-hmm.
I keep coming back to wanting to expose them to more than one, as opposed to all in JavaScript or, Python, and thinking, they would learn more of it. But I also think it's more important, even, at this age, exposure is even more important than learning the specific syntax, memorizing the syntax of any one language. I want the kids to see that, there are different languages. They do similar things. The syntax is different. They may, run a little bit different, but that I don't want them to get down one track and not realize that, hey, I could jump over here and learn this also with the same understanding, I guess.
Yeah, there's definitely a balance you have to strive for between, like, on one end of the continuum, it's like, I only want to teach one language. On the other end of the continuum, it's like, I want to teach all the languages. It's a balance of, like, breadth versus depth in that, like, if you're just doing one, you can really go deep and dive deep in that one. But if you're doing all of them, then it's like, okay, we're learning how to do just the bare minimum every single week, learning the same concepts, but just like typing in different syntax or dragging in different syntax blocks.
Right.
And so like that kind of becomes a little bit of a problem.
Yeah, I agree. There's that balance, and I've got really, really limited time with these kids. So I try to make it really count. This is what I have decided is probably best for my students.
So what you mentioned earlier with wanting to see kids discover things, how have you seen discovery when it comes to transfer from one language to another?
When we talk about loops and conditions, really the basics. And so when I introduce, a new, the other language, then I try to talk about the concept as opposed to that specific language. When I do JavaScript with them, they have cards that they type out code in JavaScript, and they have functions, and they have, the same elements or some of the same elements. And so we talk about how it's the same thing, just with a different syntax, a different language. And so they discover that they can do different things, but they really are using the same concepts.
And do you find after that like initial discussion that it kind of snowballs from there, or do you have to keep reintroducing the similarities over and over?
I don't think I need to introduce it over and over. I don't really have a lot of time to spend on that type of thing. So they really do seem to get, the older kids, especially the, fourth, fifth graders, they do seem to catch on that it is the same thing. Most of them do.
Yeah, one of my favorite things is when I'd ask kids, like, how did you know how to do that? Or how did you create that thing? And they'd be like, well, I did this in Scratch, so I wanted to see if I could figure out how to do it in JavaScript or in whatever language that they're working on. And like some of that transfer, it was just like mind-blowing, like the stuff that they'd come up with. Like, I never even thought of that. That's amazing.
Doesn't that make you just happy as a teacher?
Yeah, I mean, it's so cool because then I learned something, and of course I tell them like, hey, I had no idea this could happen. Now I can help out other kids with it. Or hey, can you go show this other person who's working on something similar?
That is one of the most powerful things that I have found is when I can, I can't always do it, but when I can have the students teach the other students. And especially the students who don't normally, they aren't normally the first to finish, or they aren't the one that sits with all the other kids. When I have them go and share what they have learned, it's huge.
Right. Yeah, I highly recommend that other people try that.
Yes.
One of the things that I encouraged, I had on the board these 4 steps. And the first step was basically always check the resources of the comments. So if there's comments in the code, read that. If there's resources like a tutorials or help guides, check that. But then the next 2 steps were to ask 2 peers. And then the final step was you can ask me, but if I'm working with somebody else, then you need to continue the first 3 steps. And odds are what would happen is they'd ask me a question and be like, oh, you know what? Susie is really good at that. How about you go and speak with Susie about how to do X, Y, and Z?
Yeah. And that is one thing that I do struggle with is how to best use students as a resource. You've got that, like we talked about, the balance. Well, there's a balance between the students being helpful and the students not using their time wisely with their friends, but also, you know what I mean?
No, that never happens.
But there's also the balance. I don't know how many times I say, that's not helping them, that's doing it for them. And so I have to really kind of monitor that some of the students who, just know, they can just do it, that those students don't go over to help. And I see them kind of move the other student out of the way and they're on their computer typing. I'm like, yeah. So it's kind of a complex thing to use students as teachers.
Yeah.
Powerful, but tricky sometimes.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good caveat or like caution to consider. Like, yes, a lot of people talk about collaboration and peer-to-peer learning and things like that, but it has to be modeled and it has to be reinforced continuously.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And even if you model it, they see it and they know it. That doesn't mean that when they get excited about doing it, they don't just do it. Yeah.
Yep.
And I don't think, I really don't think they don't ever seem like they're doing it because they're not trying to help. They think that they're helping.
Right.
And so I always, say, oh, thank you so much for helping. However, that's, you need to let them do it. So.
Yep. Yeah, I had to constantly model that and remind kids about that. So it was a never-ending thing, but it was definitely worth all the efforts because when I would see kids helping in a way that I was trying to encourage, like it was awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. Another thing that I really like to do, but don't have a whole lot of time to do. I have, my students, I see them 30 minutes once a week. And once you figure, once they finally get there and, transition time, it's like 22-ish minutes.
Yep.
So I don't have a lot of time to, have a whole class discussion where the kids are driving a lot of it and coming up to the board and, doing parts of it. I just recently saw another teacher doing that, and she had a whole hour with the kids. And I was so jealous
Yep.
because she was able to take that time. Teachers that are in, grade level classes that are teaching this integrated, I'm sure that they have more time to do that kind of thing, and that's wonderful.
Yeah, that is such an excellent point. I mean, the amount of time that you have is really going to impact the kind of approaches or pedagogies that you can actually use in your classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And I was in a similar place when I was teaching general music. That was once a week, 30 minutes. Then when I was teaching coding in the K-8 school, it was 3 weeks straight where they went every day of the week except for Wednesday, and it was 40 minutes every time. So it was great for project-based learning because I knew I'd see them for 3 weeks, and like they would have like almost every day that they'd be working on their project.
Wow.
But it wouldn't have worked as well when I was teaching once a week for 30 minutes each, just because that lost time, like the login time, and I forgot my password and all that stuff.
Yeah, and just getting settled into a new, a different room, different environment, different kids than you usually see in your class because they're a mix from all the other classes. So, there's a lot that goes on. And my class is an enrichment class, so I do want it to be, I don't want to say less structured, but I do want it to be, something extra and not maybe as structured.
And by enrichment, some other districts, they might refer to that as like specials.
We call it specials,
Okay.
but we were, I have, there's two other teachers that teach at the same time. One is orchestra and one is piano. And so all three of us, the kids have a choice of those three.
Okay.
And all considered enrichment classes.
Okay.
But they also call us specials, yes.
Okay, so kids are opting in to one of those three?
Yes.
Okay, interesting.
It's an interesting choice.
Yeah, and it's an interesting set of classes. I approve of all three, but it's just an interesting mix.
Yeah, I totally agree.
That would actually be a tough choice to pick from.
I know, and the thing is, all the kids get general music, so they still get music, but the kids that want to go above and beyond, they take, whatever music class they want.
So can you tell me a story about an experience in education that continues to impact you today?
Yes, absolutely. There's probably a lot,
Yeah.
but I'm sure there's a lot, I should say. Really, there's probably two that definitely pop up in my mind a lot. I taught at a college in as a facilitator, and I ran into one of my former students a couple years later, and she was so grateful for my help. She remembered me, and I admit I did not remember her. And I had made an impact on her life. She had a job, and she was so excited when she saw me. She just had to talk to me and tell me that she was so appreciative. To realize that I had made an impact on somebody, and I felt terrible because I didn't even recognize her. But, in elementary school, a couple of years ago, I had a student, and I used to run the yearbook for all the elementary schools. And so I would have kids apply to be on the committee. And I had this one student who clearly had, his home life was probably not ideal. I picked him to be on the yearbook staff. And he was just, I don't know how many times he asked me, why did you pick me? And you really think I would do a good job? And he really was amazed that I had faith in him, that he could do it. These are not computer science stories, but so much of being a teacher is connecting with the kids. A few of them, we do make an impact. I just think about, hopefully I'm making more of an impact on more kids than I even know. Those definitely make me think.
Yeah, and it's nice knowing in the moment, but it's also nice knowing after the fact Even if you think like, oh, I don't know how great that was, but then years later when you run into a student like that, then you can find out, oh, that actually did have a good impact.
Right. Just, just the fact of caring and getting to know them, or, having that one-on-one with them,
Hmm.
some kind of connection.
How does those stories inform what you do in the classroom today?
It definitely makes me continue to strive to make connections with my kids. With so many in and out, it's really difficult to really get to know all the kids. It's actually impossible to get to know all the kids very well.
Hmm.
But I still try to, and I also especially try to make sure that I make some connection with those kiddos that you can kind of tell need the extra love, I guess I should say.
Hmm.
Give them extra kudos, extra encouragement, and make sure that they know that they're doing a good job.
Yeah, and you're doing all that in 30 minutes once a week, which is difficult to
Trying
do.
to.
Yeah. Yeah, and I point that out because I've worked with some pre-service and in-service educators, and like a lot of the music educators that I've worked with, they have similar schedules where they just see kids so infrequently, or they're working with a group of like 100 plus kids all at once.
Yeah.
And it's a common complaint that like I don't know how to find the time for that, so it's difficult. But striving for that, I mean, any way that you can find time, even if it's just a moment or two, to connect with kids one-on-one, it's just a good thing.
Right. And that's why, I have my classes are anywhere from like 10 to 23 kids.
Mm-hmm.
I know that I don't succeed every class, but I try to every class at least say good morning to each student, or have something where they're not just sitting there working and I haven't acknowledged them in any way. I try very hard. So I love what I do. I wish I had more time with them.
Yeah.
Although that's probably the story of every teacher.
Yeah, and more time on specific areas and less in others. Like less
Yeah.
time testing, more time doing the stuff that matters.
Yeah.
So what are some of the things that you kind of wish you knew when you first started out? So like if there's a new CS educator in the audience, maybe they've taught for a few years but haven't done CS, what kind of advice could you give them?
Definitely advise them to not feel intimidated by teaching computer science, and that to be the facilitator instead of the teacher. And the things that we talked about previously about, don't you can't know everything, and don't expect to. And the kids will learn, and if they can teach you something, that is even better for the students. If they know something that you don't know, think of how that would make them feel. Just embrace the fact that you don't have to know anything. The other is, it depends on if it's like a school-wide or district-wide.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely, I would encourage the teachers to try to get training for the teachers, some sort of outside curriculum training to help everybody be more comfortable, be on the same page, to make a plan.
Mm-hmm.
Not just have, the teachers kind of, not, I don't want to say floundering, but have the teachers trying to come up with things on their own. Get together and figure out, start slowly and have a plan.
Yeah, the nice thing is there are a lot of organizations that help with that. So I work at a nonprofit that does that. If you're interested in it, you can find stuff like that in the show notes. But one of the things that we do is work with the district administrators on how to implement things. And we're doing this months before we ever do the first PD, because we really want to help them make this a smooth process and think through all the things that they need to think through. Like, what about stipends? What about substitute time? When are we going to do the PD? How often, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Could you elaborate on what you mentioned with being a facilitator? What does that mean, and how does that differ from what some people might think of as typical teaching?
A facilitator, in my mind, guides the students in directions and doesn't take, you don't walk in front of them, you walk next to them in the journey. There are definitely times when you have to get up and you have to be the teacher. You have to teach them, okay, this is what a loop is, or, things like that. But you're also bringing them in the learning process with their ideas and so on. when the kids are learning how to code and actually in there doing it, you need to let them struggle. You need to let them make mistakes, and you need to let them do some self-learning as well. And it's really hard sometimes when either you know the answer or you see them really struggling
Yep.
and you're like, ah. So sometimes I have to really stop myself from doing that. Anyway, so that's what I think is a facilitator, is somebody that is next to them instead of in front.
Yeah, I really like that response. That was great. Okay, so what's something related to education that you're really good at or knowledgeable of that most people don't know about you?
I think probably one of my strengths that most people probably don't know about, I guess, would be being able to teach basic concepts in a way the kids understand. There are a lot of people in I mean, most people don't really know what I do in my class. And, they're busy with their thing, and that's fine. But there's a lot more to computer science than just coding and, block-based coding and things like that. There's a lot of concepts, there's a lot of thinking, a lot of background knowledge involved. And I have really been working hard the last few years, especially finding ways to teach these in ways that the kids can relate to. Unplugged card games for conditions, and examples of what is a function, and using fun examples for that. So I think that the kids, I'm finding ways to teach these, just fundamental computer science, coding concepts to the kids. The whole idea of binary is just mind-boggling. It still is to me, to think everything has zeros and ones. And so I talk about that. I touch on that so that the kids have some sort of concept that, there's not really this video on your hard drive or out in the cloud. It's all stored in a very, very amazing way.
So this is a very random aside. The logo for the podcast, it has binary in the background, and it does actually say something in that binary. So if you were to type it out, you'll be able to figure it out. So it's just a little hint for everybody who's interested in nerdy stuff like that.
I actually created some worksheets with binary to translate binary back and forth. And, hear me, I thought this was great. I love this. And I did it with just a few of the kids last year, but boy, I'm going to hit it this year. Little messages and yeah.
Was the ability to teach fundamentals really well, was that something that you were always good at or knowledgeable of?
I definitely have improved. I mean, I've definitely worked at it. I think probably just being around the kids, that age group, and having my own kids, grow up, being able to kind of have a good idea of what they relate to and things like that. I think that helped me to be able to really sit back. I mean, there are lots of times when I'm just sitting there thinking about a concept and trying to find something relatable, put a whole bunch of ideas down and then see what really works in my mind, and then presenting it and honing it and, that type of thing. So I definitely learned over time.
That's good to hear. Hopefully, teachers who are new to CS will take that to heart and understand that it will come over time. Don't worry about it. You'll get better at it if you keep working at it, and you'll eventually get more tools or tricks.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So for some background information, Sandy and I met, what was it, like 2 years ago to help create the Wyoming computer science standards?
It was probably just about exactly 2 years. I can't believe that it's been that long.
Time flies.
Yeah.
So could you share with everyone how you got involved with the review committee or the writing process?
I saw the call for people who wanted, for people to apply to be on the committee to write the very first Wyoming computer science standards. And I thought that would be great. At the time, I was back taking classes, finishing up. I have my bachelor's in computer science and my master's in elementary ed, and I wanted to get an endorsement to be able to teach computer science. And so I was back in school taking, a few classes that were required, and I thought, this fits right in with me. I think I could help. So I applied and was on that, and I learned so much being on that committee. My job, I don't give grades, and I don't have any formal assessments, in computer science. And so I really had a very vague understanding of how standards work and no understanding of how they're written. And this was so enlightening, not only, how the process goes, but also just having, seeing and being part of concrete standards that the kids should learn. I've taken those thoughts into my class. I can't cover them all in my limited time, but I definitely have those in my sight as I'm teaching. And I would encourage anybody to, look at your state and see if they're, looking for people to be on committees. And we even had people on our committee that weren't computer science people. There were parents and there were people who were like science teachers, and there was a huge mix. So it was very, very enlightening. It was great.
Yeah, and I'd reiterate all of that. It was a really good experience. And so I'm in Arizona, and I was able to still help out with writing the Wyoming computer science standards. It's just a matter of knowing what the call is. So if you are in touch with your local state, or if you are looking at organizations like code.org, then you can find when a state is looking to create some new standards or to revise their standards, and you can jump on board. And it is a really good process. At least that one was.
That's true. I don't know what the other states do, but I imagine they're similar. Hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully, because it was good. I mean, we had such good discussions, like really deep discussions about pedagogy and just like research and understandings, and like, well, what does this mean for this type of class? What does this mean for this other type of class? And there was so much that went into writing those standards.
Yeah, and like you said too, just the discussions with other people, their point of view or their thoughts on it, or, different ways of thinking about it that, we all have our own little way of thinking about things. It really opened up my thought process looking at some of this stuff. It was just wonderful.
What questions have I not asked you that you would like to discuss?
I have a question for you and related to this. When you were teaching computer science, what grades was it that you taught through?
It was K through 8.
Through 8th, okay.
Mm-hmm.
My classes are so predominantly male.
Mm-hmm.
Did you find that the girls continued to stay interested, or did you see a big difference in the interest in the girls and the boys?
So it's a little bit different in that my classes were mandatory, so everybody had to be there whether they wanted to or not.
The interest, though, did you see that, the kids, were the girls embracing it as much as the boys?
I honestly did not notice a difference in interest levels among genders. Like some of the kids that I can think of right off the top of my head who I had to have that talk where you sit down and like, okay, I'm giving you this opportunity to learn this really cool thing and you're not taking advantage of it. How can I modify what I'm doing to make this even cooler for you? Most of those conversations were actually with boys. And most of those conversations were resolved with, okay, so you like playing video games, right? Oh, well, me too. Well, did you know that you can learn how to code your own video game, or you can modify it, like basically add in your own cheat codes, et cetera, et cetera? Mm-hmm. And then I'd like show them how to remix something, and then they'd like hit the floor running, and suddenly they actually really like what they're doing. So most of those conversations were with boys, and most of the girls that I can think of didn't have those conversations with me. There were a couple, but not nearly as many as the boys. So the interest thing, I've found that when you open up the space so that kids can create something that they're interested in, it's almost a non-issue, because it's like, well, what is your interest? How can you explore that interest with code or with computer science? Most kids will run with that. But if you were to take an approach where, all right, we're all going to learn this project and everyone's going to create the exact same replica of this thing, then that's where you can start to have some issues among different identities and whatnot. At least that's kind of in my experience.
Yeah, for my experience, I think part of it is because the students are, they have to make a choice between, orchestra, piano, or technology. And I remember when I was going through school, it didn't seem to be this, big gender thing. And I remember in one of my classes just a couple years ago, one of the things I had to write a paper on the gender difference in computer science.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw that from like 80s was the highest number of females in the computer science programs in colleges, and it has gone down since then.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting that there were different suggestions or thoughts on why that was. And it's just something that I've thought about because, like I said, my classes usually have I probably have, 10% girls in my classes. I'm not sure, I don't necessarily want to change that because I don't want to discourage girls from taking music if they want it, some instrument.
Mm-hmm.
But I was just wondering, how if you saw any differences in the interest rate in your classes, especially because they were required.
Yeah, no, I didn't, but I think that was mainly due to the approach that I used. If I had gone a more linear, everyone does the same thing, then I imagine I would have seen that. That being said, have you ever just like sat down with people who've chosen piano or orchestra and just been like, so I'm just curious why you chose this one? What are you interested in? Or knowing your schedule, you probably don't even have time to go into those classes to do that and ask those questions.
I don't, but it's also something that I don't want to put the kids, that has crossed my mind, but I don't want to put the kids on the spot. Well, why did you pick somebody else's class instead of mine?
Right.
But, the girls in my class, it's so refreshing to see that some of them absolutely latch on to the coding part of my curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
At one school this year, I actually am doing a lunchtime coding club, and I decided to split it up girls and boys. So one week I meet with the girls and one week is the boys club. And I'll tell you what, when I mentioned that, the girls cheered. And that was kind of telling because I know the boys can be more overbearing in some, sometimes I think the girls do feel a little bit more lost in there. So I really have been working on trying to find out how I can, keep them feeling as empowered in class. And so that's why I asked you, is I was just wondering if you had, or just individualized projects, which I try to do as much as I can. So,
but with that, like if kids are choosing which class they're going to go to, sometimes they make those choices not based on interest, but just because, oh, well, my friends are in there. And I say that as like, when I taught band at the elementary level, it was that style of class where like you could choose to go to band, you could choose to go to orchestra, etc. Because I saw every kid when I taught general music, I was able to just like, hey, what do you like about orchestra class? Or what do you like about the other class that's offered during the band class? And not in like a judgmental, why aren't you in my band kind of a thing.
Yeah.
But just like, just so I could understand. And a lot of it, the responses were, oh, well, my friend's in it. It could be as simple as that. I mean, another thing, it could just be that kids don't know how awesome the class is and the things that you can create in it. So like if there's a way that you could showcase projects from different identities and different kids with the larger population, that would be great. But since you're at multiple schools, that would probably be very difficult to do.
Yeah, I just would like to make sure that the girls are, finding the interest at a young age so that they don't go up to the middle school and feel like they've already lost 5 years of knowledge or
right.
Yeah, I was just curious.
In my experience, even if they go all through elementary school and they don't engage in a subject area very deeply or even at all, they can still be very successful at it. So like I didn't start anything music related until 8th grade, which
Wow.
for the district that I was in, like if you didn't start in 4th or 5th grade, like the odds of you starting in late middle school or in high school is just unheard of. Like that,
Right.
it's
Yeah.
very hard to do. But if you have educators who are willing to start a beginner at what's basically an advanced level, then you're able to do it. So it's okay if kids don't get into coding until later. Like I didn't learn programming until my junior year of high school. And then I stopped doing it for like a decade and then came back to it and was able to pick it up again. So like people can learn how to do this. It's just not everyone's going to be in the classes in the elementary grade, especially when they have to pick one class or another.
Right. Right. And I mean, I didn't start any until I got to college. You know, I was in the Air Force. I was working on computers, but it wasn't coding. And it was just, you know, like IT stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Got out and decided I loved it. And that's when I went to college to become a programmer. So,
Yeah. And for my own kind of like bias and understanding of education, I think what's more important is not that we teach specific subject areas, but teach kids how to learn.
yeah.
Because in the end, like a decade from now, the things that they're learning, odds are some things are going to be different. They're going to need to learn something new. So we really
Right.
need to focus on that. And especially if you're going into the STEAM or STEM fields, like it's changing every hour. Like there's a
Right.
new language releasing every week and there's new platforms to develop for. Like you just have to know so much about how to learn because it's always changing. And that's one of the things that I love about it, but it's also one of the things where it's kind of frustrating because if you take a break for a month, it's like, oh, okay, everything I know is out of date almost.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with you that it's more important the kids learn how to learn on their own and to not be afraid to fail and, you know, to really want to explore the different things, you know, whatever they're working on, coding or whatever, that they're willing to look around and find, you know, different ways of doing it.
Yeah, and that's the one of the big challenges as educators is how do we encourage that? How do we do that across all K through graduate or however long kids are in school?
Yeah, but no, I totally agree. Computer science is probably the toughest of the topics because it is changing and it's relatively new.
And with that, that concludes this episode. I really hope you enjoyed this particular interview. Sandy is a wonderful person, and I've enjoyed our conversations over the past couple of years and look forward to many more in the future. If you're interested in checking out the relevant resources and links related to this particular episode, remember it's just at jaredoleary.com and click on this particular show note. If you would be so kind, please feel free to leave a review. By now, the podcast should be available on all major platforms. If they are not, please write to your local congressperson to get it sorted out. I'm just kidding. Don't do that. They'll probably ignore you. If it's not available on a platform, just let me know. You can hit the contact me button on my website. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen, and I hope you all have a wonderful week. We will be back next week with another episode where I unpack some scholarship.